whoever has never read the original work, upon watching the Hobbit trilogy, has many reasons to believe that Galadriel is superior to Gandalf, both hierarchically and in raw power. The clearest moment showing this happens when Gandalf defends the dwarves' right to attempt reclaiming the Lonely Mountain. He tells Elrond that Thorin Oakenshield does not need permission or explanations from anyone. And, to be honest, neither does he. Elrond then replies, "It is not me you must answer to." Galadriel appears and Gandalf nearly jumps and
You did the matter.
Mithrandid.
Elrond's words and Gandalf's reaction strongly suggest that Gandalf owes no explanations to Elrond, but he does to Galadriel. Regarding power level, the films show Gandalf being defeated by Sauron with relative ease in Dol Guldur, while Galadriel banishes the Dark Lord with overwhelming force. In another moment, Gandalf is overpowered by a muscular orc, while Galadriel disintegrates this same orc instantly. Given these concrete film events, it is hard not to conclude that Galadriel appears superior to Gandalf, both in hierarchy and power. This is actually a recurring question in Tolkien discussion forums. Here's one example. In the movies, Galadriel seems more powerful than Gandalf, both in The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings movies. Is that the case in the books as well? If so, what's the reason? I thought she is an elf with a ring of power for sure, but so does Gandalf. And Gandalf is of the same race as Sauron. Aren't they supposed to be more powerful than elves? A good question, right? Let's investigate Tolkien's writings and reach a grounded conclusion in this video. Galadriel is indeed one of the most important elvish figures in Tolkien's legendarium, and the respect shown by Gandalf toward her in the films makes sense. I say this for several reasons, but I will mention only two to keep the video concise. First, Galadriel was a prodigy. Communicating through thought was a trait typical of the Ainur, the primordial spirits, not of elves. Despite that, she possessed this gift since childhood. Quoting Unfinished Tales, "From her earliest years she had a marvelous gift of insight into the minds of others." Gandalf already loved elves and men by nature, and Galadriel's gift only made him admire and respect her even more. Another reason for Gandalf's respect is that he knew Galadriel had opposed Sauron during the Second Age. Long before the Order of Wizards, the Astari, even arrived in Middle-earth. Quoting Unfinished Tales again, "In Eregion, Sauron posed as an emissary of the Valar, sent by them to Middle-earth, thus anticipating the Astari. He perceived at once that Galadriel would be his chief adversary and obstacle. All of this combined justifies the admiration others hold for her. But does it mean she is superior to Gandalf in power or hierarchy? To reach a coherent conclusion, we must separate the cinematic universe from Tolkien's original canonical writings. Let us examine hierarchy first and then their power. Quoting the Silmarillion, "In that time was first made the Council of the Wise that is called the White Council, and therein were Elrond and Galadriel and Círdan, and other lords of the Eldar, and with them were Mithrandir and Curanir. And Curanir, that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief, for he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir should be the lead of the council, and Saruman begrudged them that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great, but Mithrandir refused the office." In other words, hierarchically, it was neither Galadriel nor Gandalf. It was Saruman who held the final say and the decisive authority within the council. Still, notice that Tolkien makes a point of stating that Galadriel wanted Gandalf to be the leader. Gandalf, not herself. And this is no small detail. Gandalf was the wisest among all of his order, and even some of the Valar valued his counsel. Quoting the Silmarillion again, "Wisest of the Maiar was Olorin. He too dwelt in Lorien, but his ways took him often to the house of Nienna." And Galadriel was not the only one to recognize his worth. Círdan, another elven lord, chose to give Narya, the Ring of Fire, to Gandalf, not Saruman. In summary, despite Elrond's line in the film implying Gandalf owed explanations to Galadriel, in the original material, Saruman was the leader. It was Saruman who held the final say and the decisive authority within the council. Now let us analyze whether Galadriel is superior to Gandalf in power. The cinematic feats that make her appear more powerful, banishing Sauron or disintegrating the muscular orc, do not occur in the original books. There is no direct confrontation with Sauron in the text. When the White Council went to Dol Guldur, Sauron was still recovering his strength and chose to withdraw to Mordor rather than face them. The ones who stayed behind to fight and buy him time were the Nazgul. And here, once again, it was Saruman who stood out. Quoting Gandalf's account in the Fellowship of the Ring, Saruman has long studied the arts of the enemy himself, and thus we have often been able to forestall him. It was by the devices of Saruman that we drove him from Dol Guldur. It might be that he had found some weapons that would drive back the Nine. But this does not mean Galadriel has no feats in the books. During the War of the Ring, forces from Dol Guldur attacked Lorien multiple times, and she was powerful enough to keep them from entering. Quoting the Return of the King, 3 times Lorien had been assailed from Dol Guldur, but besides the valor of the elven people of that land, the power that dwelt there was too great for any to overcome, unless Sauron had come there himself. Unfortunately, the professor does not go into detail about how she achieved this. I personally suppose it might have been a lesser version of Melian's girdle, where Galadriel used mental power to confuse or repel enemies. Considering that Melian had been a mentor to Galadriel in the First Age, perhaps it was something similar. But this is, of course, speculation. Now let us attempt to reach a conclusion on who was more powerful. This question is not as straightforward as it seems. At first glance, one might say, this is easy. Gandalf is a Maya and she is an elf. Therefore, he must be more powerful. But Gandalf came to Middle-earth with his power deliberately limited, bound to the body of an old man, so we must account for these limitations. Therefore, I will consider their greatest feats as the best comparison. Galadriel's greatest feat is the defense of Lorien. We can agree that repelling invading hordes is an impressive achievement, but in the same passage where Tolkien emphasizes her power, he also establishes a limit. Quoting again, "The power that dwelt there was too great for any to overcome, unless Sauron had come there himself." However, Sauron at that time was weakened. He had lost the One Ring, which contained much of his power, and had his body destroyed twice, once in the fall of Numenor and again in the War of the Last Alliance. In other words, even a thrice-weakened Sauron would still have been able to overcome Lorien. By contrast, the Balrog Gandalf defeated was a Maya, of the same order as Sauron, who had never had its body destroyed and who had been dormant for roughly 5,000 years. Nothing in the text suggests the Balrog lost power by sleeping. In fact, upon awakening it single-handedly annihilated the greatest dwarven host of the Third Age. Gandalf defeated this creature, even though he died from his wounds afterward. Could Galadriel have achieved the same feat? All of this discussion applies to Gandalf the Grey. As for Gandalf the White, he is indisputably superior. Tolkien explicitly states that, in moments of great need, he could draw upon his angelic power. Quoting letter number 156, "Gandalf really died and was changed. That, I should say, is what the Authority wished as a set-off to Saruman. The crisis had become too grave and needed an enhancement of power. So Gandalf sacrificed himself, was accepted and enhanced and returned. He is still under the obligation of concealing his power and of teaching rather than forcing or dominating wills. But where the physical powers of the enemy are too great for the goodwill of the opposers to be effective, he can act in emergency as an angel." If you like this kind of video, consider subscribing and leaving a like for more. It really helps small channels like this. Take care and see you in the next one.